This is the Living Vertizontal podcast, brought to you by The Church at Riverstone, a fellowship of the Church of the Nazarene in Madera, California. Our episode today focuses on Matthew 22:34 through 46, which turns back to a question from the Pharisees about the greatest commandment, and Jesus' question to them about whose son the Messiah is.
Hi, everybody. I'm Nick.
I'm Natasha.
I'm Brittany.
I'm Derek.
And we are the Living Vertizontal podcast. And we are excited to be back with you guys as we close out Matthew chapter 22. As a quick reminder, last week we worked through the middle section of Matthew chapter 22, looking at verses 15 through 33. And as we explored that, we looked at Jesus' statement on paying the imperial tax to Caesar, as well as his response to the Sadducees' question on marriage at the resurrection. And as a result, we discussed this idea of life stewardship and what it looks like and what it means to root our identities in Christ rather than anything else. This week, as we close out chapter 22, we'll be turning back to another question from the Pharisees about the greatest commandment, and then we're going to see Jesus have the opportunity to ask a question of those around him about whose son the Messiah is. I believe today we have Natasha reading. So Natasha, would you read Matthew chapter 22, verses 34 through 46?
Yes. Hearing that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, the Pharisees got together. One of them, an expert in the law, tested him with this question: "Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law?" Jesus replied, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment, and the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments." While the Pharisees were gathered together, Jesus asked them, "What do you think about the Messiah? Whose son is he?" "The son of David," they replied. He said to them, "How is it then that David, speaking by the Spirit, calls him Lord? For he says, 'The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I put your enemies under your feet.' If then David calls him Lord, how can he be his son?" No one could say a word in reply, and from that day on, no one dared to ask him any more questions.
All right. Thank you for reading that, Natasha. As we jump into a conversation on this passage today, one thing that I would just like to make a note of right from the start is, the Sadducees had been silenced and weren't able to catch Jesus up in their question as they were intending to. And the disciples of the Pharisees and the Herodians also weren't able to catch Jesus up in their questions like they were thinking they were going to be able to. And so now the Pharisees come and are working to catch him up, and they throw their best at it, right? Like previously they sent their disciples. Now not only are they bringing in like the heavy hitter Pharisees, but they're bringing in an expert in the law to ask a question about the law. And the intention behind this is this expert in the law is just that. He is an expert. And so he is going to know it backwards and forwards and everything about it and all the minutia. And so in asking him this question, they are going to know very quickly, if he doesn't answer this question exactly right, then we have essentially invalidated his authority, which is really what all this questioning has been building to all along. The reason they're asking these questions, the reason they're confronting Jesus is in an attempt to, well, I guess the first question was even, by what authority do you do these things? And so they've been trying to understand the source of his authority and then invalidate him and his authority. And so this is kind of that last-ditch effort, throwing the best we got at Jesus in an effort to bring him down.
So if anybody's going to be able to go toe to toe with Jesus, it is this guy.
This would be the guy, you would think. And so with that, I mean, the question is asked, what is the greatest commandment in the law?
I think Jesus's response here is really important. And as we've had these conversations moving throughout the Gospel of Matthew, we see his conversation about love kind of being interwoven, not always explicitly, throughout every one of his teachings. Mm-hmm. So he's constantly, we keep coming back to this conversation about the heart and how it's not so much about the following the rules, it's about your heart as you follow those rules.
Sure.
And so I feel like this really summarizes everything that Jesus's ministry has really been about and what its purpose has been throughout the 3 years that he spent walking with the disciples, doing all these miracles, teaching the crowds. This is kind of the thrust of it. And so by extension, we as Jesus's followers, this is our heartbeat. And this should be the thing that guides and shapes our motive in everything that we seek to do for the kingdom.
And so he's called to love. He's called us to love the Lord our God with all our heart, with all our soul, with all our mind. And so for me, like when I read that, he's calling us to do that, but he's getting ready to exemplify what that looks like for us. Now, I know that, they have been told of what was going to happen, but they haven't understood what's going to happen. But this word that he uses that's used on multiple occasions, love, here and love the Lord your God and love your neighbor as yourself. For me, they are the attribute of God that he desires from us. He's showing love through, or getting ready to show love, but he's already showing love as he's teaching along the way, as he's answering these questions, as he's trying to, as he has up to this point in that what we've seen through Matthew. And so I think there's an importance to the order too, in loving. We're never going to be able to love our neighbor if we don't understand what it means to love God with everything that we are. And I think we can show an earthly affection toward people, but to truly love someone, we need that transformation that takes place that's only available through Jesus. And so as we continue to learn to love Jesus with all our heart, with all our soul, with all our mind, we have this ability to love our neighbor as ourselves. That should be the byproduct of loving God. So I think that, everything that Jesus does, there's purpose with. And as we learn to love God with everything that we are, loving other people becomes increasingly easy.
I would say even the flip side is true of that. I think we can't really know what it means to love people until we begin to understand what it means to love God. But at the same time, we can't truly love God if we're not loving his creation as well. So like if we're not loving people, we shouldn't even be having a conversation about us loving God, because we're looking right past image bearers of him, right? Like regardless of how marred or imperfect that image might be in the moment, we are still created in the image of God. And so if we're struggling to love others, in a way that's a pretty good indication that maybe we're also struggling to properly love him,
right,
as he has called us to.
Right.
It's like a two-way street.
Yeah. No, I shouldn't have assumed that people know that, but yes, because we can, which I think is an issue that like the Pharisees and the Sadducees were having. You can have all the head knowledge you want, and they have a plethora of head knowledge. But Jesus isn't trying to poke their head. He's like trying to penetrate their heart. Mm-hmm. And so, for people that have, knowledge is a powerful thing, but knowledge and poor application is kind of pointless. I feel like, we can know a lot of things, but if I'm not willing to help others know what I know, then it's kind of a useless knowledge. It's just sitting here doing nothing. And so, we can have all the head knowledge, but Jesus is trying to penetrate the heart because he understands that they know things as much as their physical limitations, permit.
I think when I think about loving the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind, I think, yes, about me loving, but the more that I get to know God and the more that I learn about his character, the more that I can see his unconditional love. And I think that's something that we as a broken humanity have a hard time doing that outside of knowing the love of God. I think, without the love of God, I think there's an extent that you can love somebody, but to truly understand unconditional love, like the love of the Father, then you can truly understand looking, like you said, Nick, looking through that lens, looking through the lens that God has put before you and to see people as the image of God. Mm-hmm. It's like a full circle.
Well, I guess as I'm reading this verse, my black and white mind is kind of like breaking it down, and I'm wrestling with the questions of what does it mean to love God with my whole heart? What does it mean to love him with my whole soul as opposed to my whole heart? Like, why not just say with your whole heart? What does it mean? What does it add when I say, well, love him with your whole mind? And so I think I was just beginning to break that down and think about what are the hallmark characteristics of each of those that come into play in an effort to help me understand better maybe the areas where I don't love God as well as I should. So I guess as I read loving God with my whole heart, I think about, like, this is my passions and my desires. And so these are the things that I guess, I don't know, propel me or motivate me to something. And so loving God with all my passion, wanting to serve him, as my primary desire. And maybe that's the one I think that probably is easiest for me to think of when I think about loving God that way. The next one, soul, I think for me is a little bit trickier. But when I think about my soul, the things the soul is eternal. So the things that don't fade. So I don't know, like your beliefs or your values. What does it look like for me to love God with the values that I hold, the morals that I hold, or essentially the world view that I hold? And then I guess for mind, as I was wrestling with that, I mean, these are my thoughts. What does it look like for me? And I think maybe this for me might be the most challenging one because I tend to think very logical and I don't behave very impulsively. Everything for me needs to be calculated, and God doesn't work that way. He doesn't work in my calculations. And so what does it look like for me to love God with my mind? And I think for me, I feel him stretching me to get beyond what's calculable, get beyond what's logical or reasonable, and to surrender my every thought to him, especially those where I'm trying to plan and orchestrate and kind of take over part of his role in my life that he's called me to submit or to give up to him.
As you say that, it makes me wonder if, like, Jesus using that specific reference because of he knows the audience. Like, we know Jesus does things intentionally. And so they seem to be more logically based because the scripture, like the law, is very black and white. And so for them, they're just taking it at like face value. Like, this is what the law says, so this is what I'm supposed to do. And it doesn't allow, like, they don't have to really think about it or put any heart, like not to say that their heart's not in it, but like it's like this is what I like. They've become so regimented, and Jesus is trying to get beyond all of that, all of the black and white, because as I said, he's trying to penetrate their heart and their practices that they've been so accustomed to carrying out for generation upon generation of this is the way it's always been, and this is the way, like for them, this is the way it's always going to be, unless the guy who wrote the law like is able to help them see beyond what they've seen up to this point. So, you know, I Jesus doesn't do anything by accident. And as you said that, it just, you know, it makes sense to me why he would do that, because they think very black and white.
Well, and I think even with that, like, I agree with what you said in the sense of, like him knowing his audience, like the him saying the first and greatest commandment, love the Lord your God. Like this is a callback to the Shema, and so this is Deuteronomy 6, 4, and 5, and this is something that was the common practice of a good Jew would be to recite this every morning. So this, for Jesus to answer this as, you know, what is the most important, what is the greatest commandment, for him to answer with this, like you can't really argue that when you don't recite the rest of the laws every morning when you wake up, but when you wake up, you recite this one because this is important to us. And so Jesus, knowing his audience, calls this out. It's a slight change, right? Because he says mind instead of strength, because Deuteronomy says with all your strength. Matthew, Jesus's response is with all your mind. And I think that there is this piece that he brings in, right? Saying like, now your mind's thinking about the Shema, good. You guys are super analytical. You guys have been trying to reason a way through the dismissal of my authority. And so I need to call you guys out to this and help you realize, like, you know what the most important law is. I know what the most important law is. Now let's start like implementing that in the way that we're handling and treating each other and working with each other. And so, yeah, I agree. I think Jesus did know his audience, and he takes it further, right? Like he references Deuteronomy, and then he goes to Leviticus when he says, and love your neighbor as yourself. And, you know, that's out of Leviticus chapter 19. And also in Leviticus chapter 19, God says, be holy as I am holy. Like he calls Israel to be holy as he is holy. And in explaining that and working that out and what it means to be holy as God is holy, you eventually get to this statement of loving your neighbor as yourself, caring for your brother, caring for the alien. Like you love everybody and care for them. That's what it looks like to be holy as God is holy. And so like Jesus has taken them from something that they would recognize pretty easily as the most important commandment and connected it using this word love, right? Because it's the same word love, to an additional commandment that he is saying, and the second is like it, is equally important, is similar, and that is like this love that's lived out in this life. So you have this like vertical love, you have this horizontal love, all being addressed, and Jesus is saying they are equally important. And so he's calling them to action. And I guess even beyond calling them to action, I'm looking down at my Bible and I'm reading verse 40. It says, all the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. And when I read that earlier, as I was kind of reading through this passage and studying it and preparing for this conversation, a thought hit me. I have always seen it as what I just said, a call to action. Like, this is the life that Jesus has called us to, is a life of loving God and loving others as we love God and God as we love others. Like this, interwoven, reciprocating love. But as I read all the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments, a new thought came into my mind that not only is this a call to action, but it's a call to look at all the law and the prophets, which for him to make that statement, this is all of Scripture in that day. It's a call for them to look at all of the other laws through the lens of love. So you can't have a conversation on any of the Levitical laws, however numerous they are, without looking at them through this lens of loving God and loving others.
All the law and the prophets hang on these two commands, and in both commands, love is central. If in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, so Jesus is the Word from the very beginning. The attribute from the very beginning that reigns supreme is love. God is love, and you can find that in, what was it, 1 John?
1 John. Yeah.
And so I don't know, maybe that's for me, as it ends, like he ends it with like this emphatic statement that everything's been said up to this point in Scripture defines him as love. And that's our call. That's what he's calling us to as far as loving him, but also this call to action, not only in loving him, in loving our neighbor, and viewing everything that's been written up to this point through the lens of love. And so, I don't know, for me, I think he emphatically ends it, that he is love, even for the people that think they have all the answers.
So Natasha, I'm still thinking about what you said when you were talking about breaking down the heart and the soul and the mind. And, the desire, I think, is something that really stuck to me. In every desire that I'm giving that to God. But I also think maybe this could apply to the church, and it could be a temperature gauge. Is this activity that we are doing, is it honoring God, and is it showing love to people? Are we loving our neighbor as ourself through this? And I think we can take, really everything that we do, whether it's in ministry or outside of ministry, and look at that and say, okay, this thing that I'm doing, is it honoring and showing love to God? And is it showing love to my neighbor? And I think that could help us. And I think that's part of that hanging the whole law and the prophets. I think
The lens.
Yeah, continuously thinking, is what I'm doing meeting these two commandments?
It would be an easy way to evaluate the different activities that, or I say activities, I'm not just meaning like events or anything, just activities as in the
Life
gamut
activities.
of activities that could be happening. But to hold all those up against the litmus test of, does this contain love for God and love for others? Not but love for God and love for others. And if the answer is no to one or both of those, perhaps it's something that should not be a part of what's going on, or it needs to change.
I think the motive thing is a big deal. Like you said, it may just be that it needs to be tweaked or changed.
Well, and I think you need to think about not just, so I'm particularly talking about ministry right now, but not just the people that ministry thing is serving, but also other people. Are you doing something that, you have a group that meets? Are those people that meet, are they inviting people? Are they, sharing that love or expanding that out? Or, say that, Derek and I, we had, this is outside of ministry. If we just had dinner at our house and we invited our neighbors, but we did not invite one neighbor, is that, yes, we are showing love to our neighbors that we invited, but are we showing love to the neighbor that we did not? And I think that's sometimes hard, but I think that's kind of the challenge that Jesus is putting forth. Like, not just loving the easy ones, but loving all of our neighbors.
Well, I feel like his example was perfect. Like, he's going to the people that are trying to trap him and extending grace and mercy, when it would be easy just to be like, Just like they already think what they think and already know that they're out to kill me. So like,
Why waste my time?
right. But yet in spite of that, like he essentially like charges on knowing like he has a purpose. And despite how hard it physically may be, like he doesn't just like check out because, well, they're not listening to me. He presses on, which maybe that's something we need to ask too. Like, are we giving up too easily because it's too hard? Like Jesus didn't give up in the midst of all this opposition when he knew the two objectives: love the Father and honor the Father, and love the people that God's given him to serve. And so he pressed on. And, maybe that's something we can ask ourselves. Are we pressing on even when it's hard?
Well, I'm going to expose us for a moment.
That's okay.
When I was thinking about this, I'm going to believe that God put this thought in my mind. We live in a very nice neighborhood. Within the last few months, we got exterior lights, permanent lights put on our house. We've really enjoyed having them. But we got what's that called?
A notice of like violation,
Yeah.
essentially.
Yeah. So we got that violation for, having our lights on. And what the issue was, we didn't
Get
fill out
approval.
approval yet, but we took care of that. But before we actually knew kind of the reason why, we assumed that we had somebody in our neighborhood that just didn't like that, and that they just were going to tattle on us, And our response would not measure up here. Our response, I mean, I know me personally, I was like, well, I'm just going to shine them brighter, and instead of thinking, I said that to myself. I probably told Derek and maybe a couple of friends, but when it comes down to it, even the words that I said was not honoring God or my neighbor.
Right. Well, I mean, even a few days ago, the four of us were having a conversation, and I had to come back a few days ago and say, you know what, I was wrong because my heart was not in the right place.
How different would this story of Jesus's life read, potentially, if the Pharisees had actually heard what Jesus was saying here about love being the lens through which they see everything or evaluate everything? Like, they may have still been questioning him. They may have still been leery of him potentially being a false prophet or something like that. But how would it change the way that they moved forward with him or encountered him or interacted with him if they came from a position of love rather than a position of really the absence of love? Like, they were threatened. They had animosity towards him, and it was animosity that led to him being crucified. It wasn't love, right? From their perspective. It was love from Jesus's perspective that led to his crucifixion. But just, and then play that out into our lives. Like, how often do we, as a result of our lack of loving God perfectly or loving others perfectly, lead to death in some way or another in somebody's life?
I feel like we would behave more like little children if we, if
That almost sounds biblical.
yeah, if we, truly took these commandments and loved God with all our heart, soul, and mind, and loved our neighbor as ourselves, that we would resemble little children more than we would our current position.
So as we move on from this conversation on love being the lens through which we understand the law and the action that we are called to in life, we step into this conversation that really brings the larger conversation to a head, in a sense. As a callback, this line of questioning all began with the simple question of, by what authority are you doing what you are doing? And Jesus answers their question in a sense by asking one of his own. This question of, who do you think, or what do you think about the Messiah? Whose son is he? And the Pharisees have a response, a simple response: the son of David. And this is consistent with the Davidic covenant that has been made, that was made with David, that God made with David, that the Messiah would come out of his line. By them answering the son of David, by no means did they mean, like his immediate son, but somewhere in his lineage would be the Messiah. And they knew this from the covenant made. They also knew this from the prophecies that they have studied. And so Jesus, knowing his audience, knowing where they are, knowing what they're understanding when they say the son of David, he asks a simple question again, knowing that they will know what he is referencing. And he says, how is it then that David, speaking by the Spirit, calls him Lord? And he references Psalm 110 here, which Psalm 110 is a psalm of David. It's also a psalm that was used at the coronation ceremony for the king. And so it was like this installation psalm for kings. And so in so using this particular psalm, Jesus begins to expose a potential hole in the thinking of the Pharisees. Because for them to say that the Messiah is going to be the son of David, Jesus's question is kind of throws you off balance when he says, well, why would David call his son Lord? And there's not really any response here. I mean, verse 46 says that no one could say a word in reply. And from that day on, no one dared to ask him any more questions. Because in Jesus asking these two particular questions, not only does he establish the Messiah as one that falls in line with, the descendants of David, so son of man conversation, he establishes that the Messiah is somehow something more than just the son of man. And with this Lord word used, he actually establishes the Messiah as the Son of God.
And them not asking any more questions is probably to protect themselves, because he's already kind of exposed it, and any more questions would probably only further expose how limited their knowledge truly is of who the Messiah is and the authority that he's been given. I just wonder if I fall in a similar situation as the Pharisees did here, when Jesus asks a question and I give a response and I don't like his answer. Like, then he comes back with a kind of a rebuttal, and I don't like it. Do I do the same thing where I just don't like, I just go away? No more questions. Like, I'm afraid to hear what he might say. And maybe that kind of sounds crazy, but I don't think they wanted to hear any more about how he thought they were wrong. And how often can we justify things in our own lives? We ask God for something, he gives us a clear answer, and we don't like it, so now we're just justifying, well, that must not have been God. Like, I mean, I know I've done that, and I'm sure I'm not alone, that it's easy to justify things, but, I think he's pretty clear if we're willing to listen. Like, and I think he was very clear here. They just didn't want to listen. And how often are we the same? Like, God's clear in what he's saying. Jesus is clear in what he's saying. He hasn't strayed from what he said. He's been consistent in what he said. But in every way that he's answered a question that they've had, they haven't liked his response. And now, as he like fully exposes their limited understanding, when he fully exposes my limited understanding, do I walk away the same way that the Pharisees did? Do I walk away and say, you know what? I'm done. I'm not asking that question again because I'm not getting the answer that I want.
But the truth is, when we look at this and we see what he is exposing so much more, such a better idea of who the Messiah is. You know, not just is the Messiah the son of David, but he's also the son of God. And that has to be better than just the son of David. And Derek, when I think about what you were saying, you know, yes, sometimes God, you know, points things out to me and I don't like it, but almost every single time there is a better thing. There is a better, it either helps me to be better, helps me to grow in one way or another, whether I like it or not, but the outcome is still positive.
But he's trying to fight against preconceived notions and customs of what we've grown up thinking and understanding about this Messiah that's going to come, like charging in on a horse to save us. Like he's our conquering king, our king that's going to go into battle with us. And it's just another example of how preconceived notions often fall short of what the intended purpose is, what God's intended purpose is. That knowledge isn't enough. Like knowing about what knowing the law isn't enough. The law was meant to expose, and Jesus is coming to expose. Really, it's kind of ironic. I really hadn't thought about it, but Jesus is coming to expose essentially what the law was given to expose, and they're not seeing it, and so.
Well, is it that they're not seeing it, or is it that it's so uncomfortable they don't want to see it?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that's probably a fair question.
Because I mean, so verse 46, they couldn't have a reply. Nobody dared to ask a question again. Verse 40, that exchange about the love passage doesn't have any kind of response. The last one on marriage and the resurrection statement says that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees. Like, essentially, all of these questions that people have been asking, that Jesus has exposed the misunderstanding, the misconceptions that exist, they just go silent because they are uncomfortable when met with the truth, Jesus, that is inconsistent with their beliefs that they have held for so long. And
are you saying what I've done for decades is wrong?
that's what they're struggling with. And that's hard. And I think that brings us back to a similar conversation that we had last week about, like, this is why it's so important for us to always stand before Christ with open hands, with our understandings and our beliefs and our action, like just everything. Like, that's what it looks like to live a life of stewardship, a well-stewarded life. Like, even stewarding our spirituality.
What's what it looks like to love God with
That's what
our
it looks
heart,
like to love God,
our soul, and our mind.
holding all of that before Him.
But we like as a society, we struggle with that because we have those presuppositions or those, preconceived notions, or we've grown up in this, like, this is the way it was. This is the way my grandparents did it. My parents did it. And this is the way I'm going to do it. And my kids are going to do it. And like when we do that, we don't allow God to like have his rightful place. 'Cause then it's essentially my religion. It's not what, like, it's not the truth. It's my truth.
Mm-hmm.
It's a distorted truth when we cling so tightly to the past.
So I think the question that we could ask is, when we have things that are exposed, what is our response? Is our response to accept and to trust what he is saying? Or is our response to be angry and to not listen and to go the path that the Pharisees go down?
Be sure to follow the Living Vertizontal podcast to stay current on all our new releases. To learn more about the Church at Riverstone, visit us at thechurchatriverstone.org.